been drawn to my attention that I haven't been recording. That sucks. Okay, I apologize for that. In any case, let me go back a bit. And I was doing so well, right? For those of you who are here live, you can step out for about 10 minutes or so. Apologies for that. Okay, so today, restarting this. Today, we're going to do the evidences of evolution. That's chapter 12. All right. So I always like to start this out by saying, talking about how someone who really doesn't know how evolution works or that even it exists would come to a conclusion that evolution does occur and how and what drives that bit of evolution. Okay. So I'll start off with this example. Okay, every individual organism has this great potential for reproduction. So, for example, this brown rat. This brown rat has the ability to have many offspring. From the moment that it becomes pregnant to the moment it gives birth, it will only take 21 days. And it can have potentially up to 14 live pups. And each one of those pups would only take about 5 weeks to reach their own sexual maturity and reproduce on their own. And so you might ask yourself, why then, if each rat has this ability, why then aren't there so many rats that were all swimming completely, that was not inundated in brown rats? Okay, so there are examples, though, of some populations that grow uncontrollably, and one of those examples is the human population. The human population had quite a stable population growth graph or trend for many thousands of years. If you go back to 10,000 BCE, all right, that's in the time when we didn't grow our own crops or keep our own animals. And once we started doing that, though, keeping, doing agriculture, keeping our growing our own crops in the same location, and keeping our animals, then our population was able to grow quite a bit because we've increased the number of resources that are available to us. As the began, when the modern civilization, well, I wouldn't say, when the most ancient civilizations in our history books started to show up, era, city-states, etc., and a little bit past that, then our population became stable again. Why? Because when you aggregate large numbers of people together, again, you're taxing the resources more than you've ever taxed them before, and also you increase the likelihood of gaining some sort of disease that could affect the growth of that population. So during this time, we had a lot of pandemics, epidemics. Well, we'll call them epidemics, not pandemics, because there really wasn't travel between one corner of the earth to the other as much as there is today. So the pandemic would have been less. All right, so every particular city, state, or kingdom, or whatever it was that they had back then, town or province, those locations would have been affected together by one disease or another, and they were quite frequent and often. We've all heard of the bubonic plague and Black Death of the 14, 15, and 1600s, etc. War also causes dips in population growth, but we made it through all that, and since then, our population has grown exponentially. All right, so if you have a graph, and you have, this is time and this is numbers, and your population all of a sudden shoots up, that's exponential growth. So the question is, how much exponential growth can the human population experience before our resources can no longer sustain us, right? So you got to think about. It wasn't until the 1990s that the human population had reached 6 billion in number, but it only took 15 or 20 years to go from 6 billion to 7 billion, and we're quick approaching 8 billion. So we're at 7.5 billion right now, I think. All right. Now, most populations in nature tend to remain stable. Okay. Most populations tend to remain stable. And what we mean by that is that the number of individuals within a population, and by a population, I mean a group of interbreeding individuals, of members of the same species, or members of the same species that live in the same area. That's a population. And the number of individuals within that species for that population tends to be more or less the same year after year after year after year. All right, so if organisms are able to reproduce so well with such high potential, why is it that most organisms have stable populations? Okay, so the answer, though, is because of the environment. Environmental resources are limited. Okay, so environmental resource limited, which means that there's only a certain number of individuals that the environment, the habitat that that organism finds itself in, would be able to sustain. There's only a limited number of individuals that that environment can sustain. And some individuals are better able at obtaining these resources than others. That's water, that's food, that's shelter, and even access to a mate. Right? These environmental resources are limited, and some things are better able to do. Right? Not only that, uh, because of that, only a portion of the potential offspring survive. Right? So that means that only a small portion of them, of all the offspring that have been created, are able to survive to adulthood in order to reproduce themselves, in order for they themselves to reproduce. Okay, so look at this picture here. You have the floor completely, well, in this case, almost inundated, flooded by acorns. Is each one of these acorns going to grow up to be an oak tree? Absolutely not. All right, in fact, throughout the lifetime of the oak tree, um, with all the millions of acorns it produces in the hundreds of years of life of that oak tree, in the end, on average, only two oak trees will be only two of this oak tree's offspring will survive to successfully reproduce in the future. All right, and that's the case for most organisms. In a stable environment, a habitat that remains undisturbed, and everything nice and at equilibrium, all organisms, on average, are only able to reproduce two offspring, one to replace each parent. And those offspring, reproduce successfully, I mean, those offspring are the ones that grow up and survive long enough to have offspring of their own. Right? The individual parents may have many other offspring that are not that good at creating offspring of their own, or may not reach adulthood, etc. This is in natural habitats. Right? So why is it that some are better able to obtain these resources that are necessary for survival than others? It's because not everything is built the same way, right? The genetics for every individual is different. As we learned yesterday and the day before, um, variation exists, right? Independent assortment, genetic recombination, synapses slash crossing over, and the laws of segregation. All of that deals with creating variation. Okay, so variation, it's not just the color of the fur or the color of the feathers or whatever. Variation is in all sorts of things, from any kind of physical characteristic to even or what's the word I'm used? Um, Not just physical characteristics, but also behavior. That's the word. Right, and these variable traits are heritable, as we learned yesterday. These traits are heritable. So whatever traits are phenotypically expressed, behavior or physical characteristics, if they help you survive in the environment that you're in and they help you get to a point where you can have offspring, then those offspring will also inherit those traits. So by variable traits, we mean things like what we covered in the last couple of days, where you have different alleles for the same trait, so you have different forms of expression for a particular genetic trait. For example, this salt and pepper moth, or I think they're called betula moths, or because they live on these betula trees, they're the birch trees. Um, they were doing some studies on these in Britain ages ago. And so, the studies have shown up on almost every biology book, introductory biology book or evolution book, where they were looking at this particular moth, populations of these moths in environments that differed from one another. One environment was low in pollution, either because it was before pollution started or it was away from city centers where pollution was highest. And another environment is where pollution was high. And in this population, you have two particular traits uh, of interest, where one trait is showing a moth that's dark in color, and um, the alternate allele is the light-colored moth, which blends in well on these trees that have less pollution in their environment. The reason for that is because in low pollution environments, you have more lichen growth on the trees. This is a fungus that grows on trees, and also the bark of the tree is lighter in color. So that allows for the light-colored moths to blend in very nicely. And as a result, in these populations, the vast majority of the individuals within that population are light in color. However, there still remains a portion of that population that has the dark colored morphs of this particular species. And when you take that same population and you expose it to a habitat that's been damaged by environmental pollution, where there's too much pollution for the lichens to grow in the trees, and the tree barks themselves are darker in color because of the accumulation of soot and other particles from pollution. It's now the dark colored moths that survive. All right, so the dark colored moths are better able to camouflage against the trees, so they're less likely to be hit on by birds, for example. And while the white colored moths are standing out more and much more easily seen by predators, such as birds. Right? In the opposite case, the dark colored moth was the one that stood out to predators, and the white colored moth camouflaged better. So what this tells you, though, is that survival is not something that occurs because of chance, of random chance. Survival is directed by environmental conditions. Right? Anything depends completely on the conditions of the environment, of the habitat that it's in order for it to be able to survive or not survive. All right, so this fact that natural conditions direct who can survive and who cannot is called natural selection. So evolution occurs via natural selection. Okay, so for example, in this example, you see a population of lady beetles. All right, and our definition for evolution is a change in heritable traits, in the frequency of those heritable traits within a population over time. Okay, so what we mean by that is, so here we have these beetles, 100% dark, right? No spots. But it turns out that there was a mutation that happened, and so 2 of the offspring inherited that mutation. All right, so now we have 4 out of 7 that are dark. We have a change in the frequency of that dark trait in that population. It went from 100% to 4 out of 7. And in the next generation, the third generation, just about everybody, right? So 4 out of 5 are um, are lighter colored. So you have now a huge change in the frequency of that particular trait, the color trait. And then here you have the introduction of another trait, which was spotting. So before, 100%, 0 spots. Okay, and the mutation has been introduced, and it's starting to spread. And by the end of the 6th generation, it's 100% with spots. Okay. All right, so you don't have to know any of these numbers. It's just an example. So you see here, there's a change in the frequency of a trait from one generation to the next. So please note that evolution does not occur within an individual or even within a family group. Evolution only occurs um, within a population. It's a change in a trait, in the frequency with which you can find the trait within that population over time. So evolution, the idea that evolution occurs, that organisms change from one generation to the next, or even generations down over time, that's a hypothesis. And any good hypothesis has to have a null hypothesis, like I discussed in the first recitation. So our hypothesis, right, our hypothesis that we put a little a on it for alternate hypothesis equals evolution occurs. And our null hypothesis is organisms don't change, right? And this is something that people actually believe, that organisms don't change from generation to generation, that they've always been the same from the beginning until the end. All right, but so what we have though is a situation where we have to say, well, how can we get to a point where organisms just don't change? Well, first we have to have a situation where there is no new genetic material being created. That is, no mutation. Remember, mutation is the ultimate source. So I can write that down here. Mutation is the ultimate source of new genetic material. All right, so that's where new genetic material comes from, mutation. It's not to say that you can't combine what already exists and recombine it in different ways to create new phenotypes. Of course you can, but ultimately, new genes or new genes can only come from mutations. However, when you think of what a mutation is, well, a mutation is just a mistake that was created uh, in the moment that DNA was replicating itself. All right, and you know from the last couple of lessons that DNA is always replicating itself. Every time that a cell wants to undergo mitosis, DNA is replicating itself. And if a mistake happens there, well, then it's not really going to affect the next generation. However, if that happens during gametogenesis, that's when mutations get passed on from one generation to the next. The vast majority of mutations that occur are going to be silent. That is, they don't affect the phenotype in any way, shape, or form. And that's because of the redundancy of genetic coding. So you can have, um, the bases of DNA. You take three of those bases, and three of those bases codes for a gene. And if you change one of those bases, oftentimes you get the same exact result from that gene. So that's what we mean by the vast majority of mutations are silent. They really don't affect the phenotype. The remaining mutations which do affect the phenotype, the vast majority of those are deleterious. They hurt the individual so that it's unable to survive long enough to pass that mutation down to another generation, either long enough or well enough. And the remaining minority of mutations are beneficial. Then you have to say, in order for us to support our null hypothesis, that no evolution occurs, you have to accept that natural selection does not occur, that the environment has no effect whatsoever on the survivability of any organism, which we know is not true. All right, so mutation is always occurring because DNA is always replicating. The chances that there won't be a mistake are extremely minimal. And we know that the environment has a direct effect on the ability to survive. The population of any particular organism has to be infinitely large, because if it is infinitely large, then you have the ability to maintain a single genetic pool, right? And all organisms will be very similar to one another in that case. However, we know that almost every population is not infinitely large. I don't know of any that are infinitely large. The thing that comes closest to that would be microscopic organisms like bacteria. All members of the population would have to be able to breed. We know that not every organism, not every individual organism is able to reproduce. Some are better able at obtaining a sexual partner or whatever way they reproduce than other organisms, than other individuals. All right, the closest thing that comes to that would be a bacterial population, and all mating would have to be random. That is to say that whatever you bump into, that's what you're gonna reproduce with. Uh, that's not how most, at least not that's not how most animals work. All right, maybe works for plants. Right, it's dependent on other things to take the pollen uh, to the opposite sex. But for animals, they like to choose, what they're going to breed with. This one over there looks like it can survive better than the other one, so let me try to breed with that one. All right, that sort of situation. So this is not something that happens very often. Uh, Again, the best example for something that comes close to that would be a bacterial species. Everyone produces this number of offspring. Okay, so an almost impossible situation as well because everything is affected by the environment, and the environment affects how many offspring you're capable of having. And there would be a zero change in genetics, right? So, in other words, no migration of individuals in or out of the population. If you maintain all individuals within the population, that means there's no new genetic material being introduced, or there isn't any genetic material being taken out of the population. Again, something that's very unlikely to happen. So you have to have a confluence of these seven conditions occurring, all of which on their own are almost impossible to meet for them to actually occur, in order for there to be no evolution. Excuse me. All right. So just as a reminder, for any trait, there are usually two or more alleles, right? Uh, and in those two alleles, we can use that information, knowing that if a population of organisms is diploid, you can figure out the frequencies of a particular trait within a population. And through statistics, you can actually detect whether evolution has occurred or not. Right? And usually, when scientists go out and they're studying to see whether evolution occurred in the population or not, they're talking about microevolution. And by microevolution, I mean a change in a particular trait over time, and that amount of time that we're talking about is just a couple of generations. And when you're thinking about macroevolution, the change of a species from one species to another, then you're talking about an accumulation of these small changes in traits over a very large period of time. And that's very similar to what we have in this slide. You had one trait that changed from here to here, and then you had another trait that changed from here and ended up in there. And if you kept doing that for a couple of hundred generations, the last generation would look very different than this one. So this is microevolution, but if you kept doing this over and over and keep accumulating those changes, then you would have macroevolution. Okay. All right. So evolution itself is the reason why organisms um, are related to one another by common descent. Right. So In terms of macroevolution, you can have uh, human beings, for example, have a common ancestor uh, with chimpanzees. Say that we come from chimpanzees. This is to say that chimpanzees and humans had a common ancestor, right? And I guess one portion of the population of that common ancestor had certain changes in traits, and the other one had a different set of changes in traits, and so the lineage is split. All right, so all organisms can trace their ancestry back to the very. Sorry, I lost the microphone there for a second. All organisms can trace their ancestry back to the very first cells. How do we know that? Because all cells share some very common characteristics. These are homologous characteristics. For example, we all have sort of the same kind of cell membrane and same sorts of organelles, and even the genetic coding is based off the same structure. It's ribonucleic acid, deoxyribonucleic acid. All right? And also we have the fossil record, which can show that extinct animals or extinct organisms have a lot of things in common to the extant organisms. Extant meaning currently living. Okay. So, oftentimes, for example, the morphology of the fossils is similar to what you have in living organisms. And you can even do molecular evidence can be used to compare the similarities between living organisms. So we can do a DNA study on chimpanzees and humans and compare it, and we see that we share between 96 and 98% of our DNA with them, with each other. 96 to 98% of our DNA is the same for humans and chimpanzees. What a difference 4% makes, right? Okay, so another way is the physical characteristics of the living organisms. You can use physical characteristics to compare them to each other. That's comparative anatomy. Uh, to draw relationships amongst them. Okay, so some organisms are much more similar to each other than they are to other organisms. So, for example, um, our body shape is much more similar to a chimpanzee's than it is to a gibbon, for example, with those long arms that they use for swinging, or even to other monkeys that have tails. I shouldn't say other monkeys since chimpanzees are not monkeys. Chimpanzees are apes. All right. So you have anatomical evidence and even evidence that is anatomical but found in the developing embryo. That's embryological evidence. So let's take us to fossils. All right. So what is a fossil? A fossil is any evidence of past life, any whatsoever. And we've been finding fossils from all time periods. The oldest fossils are 3.5 billion years old. Keep in mind that the planet itself is about 4 billion years old. And there are some reports of fossils as old as 3.7 or 3.8 billion years, um, which kind of shows that life began right away as soon as the oceans appeared. So this picture that I'm showing here are the stromatolites from rocks in Western Australia, which are fossilized cyanobacteria. All right, cyanobacteria is basically a blue-green algae photosynthetic bacteria, which exists everywhere today. These are not things that are extinct. And they would have accumulated on top of each other through millions of years and then harden off and become fossils. And today we can find them in Australia, and geologists are able to date them back to 3.5 billion years into the past. So we can use fossils and we can use physical characteristics to compare living organisms, or even fossil organisms to living organisms to figure out whether or not how or how much they are related to each other. So you have some terms. You have homologous characteristics and analogous characteristics. So don't confuse homologous characteristics with homologous chromosomes. No. All right. Although the term is used in both cases because it means similar things. So in this case, homologous characteristics are physical characteristics that look the same and function and may or may not function the same way though. Let's talk about analogous structures first. Analogous structures do not show how two organisms are related. However, they're analogous because they may have the same function. So for example, you may have the wing of a bat and the wing of a fly, right? An insect or a bee or butterfly. They are both used for the same purpose, that is to fly. But their structure is completely different. Insect wings are more similar to our fingernails than they are to the wings of a bat, which is a wing of a bat is extremely similar to our forearm, to our forelimbs, our arms, right? So uh, here we have a human arm. It has a humerus, a radius, an ulna, right? Some carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, which are the digits. And a bat has the same humerus, maybe a fused radius and ulna. So some carpals, metacarpals, and some phalanges. This picture is in your book, so you guys can look at this more closely. All right, and so a human arm is much more similar in structure than a bat arm, and the reason for that is because bats and humans are both mammals. And they're both mammals because they both have a common ancestor, right? Way back in geological time. And the same thing goes for these other things. The wing of a bird, for example, this has a humerus, a radius, an ulna, and some fused carpals and metacarpals, and a couple of phalanges. Not as many as what mammals and the other organisms have. So this is a little bit different, but it has the same rudimentary structures. Right, so these are homologous structures, all of these. And why? Because of the ancestral condition. The ancestral condition also has. I don't know if I can zoom in. The ancestral condition also has the humerus, right, and the radius, and the ulna, and the carpals, metacarpals, and the phalanges. There's molecular data. Okay, molecular data just shows what I was telling you before. Molecular data just backs up the relationships that researchers have been finding. Uh, let's just say researchers have been hypothesizing on based on comparative um, morphology. All right, so how similar the DNA is between two living organisms corresponds to how closely related they are to each other. And that's because, well, here you can see the base pairs or the bases of DNA, right? In these ATCGs, okay, which in triplets form they get transcribed to RNA, which is the opposite copy of the DNA strand, and that those bases, every three bases, creates a code for a particular amino acid. So, like leucine, serine, tyrosine, etc. You have a combination of those together, which make a protein. So this is how your cells make proteins. Start with the genetic information, which gets transcribed into something that the ribosomes can read and create a string of amino acids, which create proteins. And therefore you can compare the basis of the DNA strands to the basis of the DNA strands of another individual and see how many changes there are between the two individuals. And the more changes there are, the more differences there are, the more unrelated those two organisms are. So like I was saying before, chimpanzees and humans, there's only about a 4 to 6% difference in the DNA. Okay. All this time I didn't realize I could zoom in and zoom out. Okay, so I'm going to break for about 3 minutes, and I'm going to come back and we're going to look at the chapter in the book and fill out. There's a lot of things that we're going to skip from this chapter as well. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm back, and we're going to go into the lab manual now. All right, so here we have The evidences of evolution. All right, this is chapter 12. All right, and basically they're talking about evolution is the process by which organisms are related by common descent. All right, a little bit of a simpler um, definition for evolution compared to what I gave you guys. All right, but both are equally good. Right. And in this page, they talk about the geological timescale. So, in order for people to understand what the meaning of fossils is, how old fossils can possibly be, you have to start getting into your mind a map, a mental picture of how long life has been around. Okay. So, let's see. Division of the geological timescale. They're talking about this thing here. All right, so this is the geological timescale, and it's composed of eras, periods. The eras are subdivided into periods. The periods are subdivided into epochs, and the epochs are further subdivided, but it's not listed here. All right, in this column, they're showing you the actual age for those times. And then they're giving you some examples of plant and animal life that existed at that time that may be different from what you find today. Right? And that era, there are about 4 eras. You have the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic, the Paleozoic, and the Precambrian time. Precambrian time is the oldest at 4.5 billion years ago. That's when the Earth formed. Those oldest known prokaryotic fossils that I was showing you before, the cyanobacteria, 3.5 billion years ago. All right, those are photosynthetic. That's when they first started showing up, and it took about 1 billion years for them to produce enough oxygen to affect the atmosphere. There. All right, so yeah, it's the cyanobacteria are the main oxygen producers on this planet. And still, it took another 7 or 600 million years for the first eukaryotic cells that look like our cells, to appear. So prokaryotes, this was the planet of the prokaryotes up until then. And these old eukaryotic cells are very primitive compared to what we find today. Here you have the first protists. The protists is another kingdom of eukaryotic organisms. You have the fungi, you have the animals, you have the plants, and you have the protists. Examples of protists would have been the euglena that we saw in lab number 2. And it's not until 630 million years ago that the oldest soft-bodied invertebrate fossils are found. Invertebrate being animals without a backbone. Okay, so list the 4 eras in the timescale starting with the Precambrian time. Where you have the Precambrian, right? Precambrian. You have the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Meso meaning middle, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. That's the time period that we're in right now. Using the geological timescale, you can trace the history of life by beginning with Precambrian time at the bottom of the timescale. The timescale indicates that the first cells arose some 3.5 billion years ago, 3,500 million years ago, or 3.5 billion years ago. The prokaryotes evolved before any other group. Why do you read the time scale starting at the bottom? No, that's the oldest. That's the oldest time period, right? The first events, the oldest time period. You know, the first events in Earth history occurred there. The Precambrian time was very long, lasting from the time the Earth first formed um, until about 500 million years ago. The fossil record during the Precambrian time is meager, right? There's not much. But the fossil record for the Cambrian period onward is rich, for reasons still being determined. This helps explain why the timescale usually does not show any periods until the Cambrian period of the Paleozoic era. You can also use the timescale to check when certain groups evolved and or flourished. For example, during the Ordovician time period, the non-vascular plants appear on land. By non-vascular plants, they're talking about mosses, liverworts. Those groups still exist. All right, we all know mosses exist, liverworts also, and maybe a few other things that may have gone extinct. And also, the first jawless and jawed fishes appear in the seas. So, vertebrate. That is, these are vertebrates, right? Like us. So we've been around for a long time. If you consider us as part of a group that includes fish. In fact, there's a good book if you're ever interested in. It's called Your Inner Fish, and it's a quick read. Inner Fish. I think his name is Mike Neil Shubin. Yeah. Anyway, just in case you're interested. All right. During the blank era and the blank period, the first flowering plants appear. How many million years ago was this? So you go in here, right? You go in here and you look, well, where are the first flowering plants? Well, I'll tell you. First flowering plants were here. Okay, the Jurassic period. So that would be the Mesozoic, and Jurassic. Okay. Two S's for Jurassic. How many million years ago was that? That was what, 200? Yeah, 199 to 145 million years ago. Yeah, 200. MYA. Sometimes you see the time periods listed as MA, which means mega ons, which means mega years, right? Mega meaning a million. That's like the metric system for years, for measuring time. Okay, and on the time scale, note the Carboniferous period. During this period, great swamp forests covered land. That's where most of our petroleum and coal come from. Here it is. These are also called coal-forming forests because, with time, they became the coal we burn today. How do you know that the plants in this forest were not flowering trees, as most of our trees are today? Okay, go back to the Cambrian. First plants appear. What are they saying? Oh, Carboniferous. I apologize. Age of great coal-forming forests. Ferns, club mosses, horsetails. These are not flowering plants. Not to mention that the first flowering plants are not found until a million and a half, 150 million years later, right? So you can say, uh, the fossils are composed of non-flowering plants. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a flowering fern before. Fossils are of non-flowering plants. I've never seen a moss flower either. And first flowers appear here at this time. What type of animal was diversifying at this time? By diversifying, they mean what group or clade, what large group of organisms which are closely related to each other were speciating. We're creating lots of species. And at this time, we have amphibians. Right? It's not when they first appeared, but when they were becoming very common and highly variable throughout the planet. So, take a look at these amphibians, right? They show up, the first time they show up is about 400 million years ago. They survive lots of great mass extinctions. They survived this one, that one, and the one that killed so many dinosaurs that are famous in our imagination today. Right? So they survived a whole bunch of different mass extinctions. And they're endangered today as a group. The entire group is endangered today. So leave it up to human beings to, really mess things up. They're endangered because of climate change and because of an introduction of a fungal disease, habitat loss. The fungal disease is also directly caused by human activity, and habitat loss, which is caused by human activity as well. All right. Somebody should stop humanity. You should associate the Cenozoic era with the evolution of humans. Among mammals, humans are primates. During what period and epoch did primates appear? All right. So no, I wouldn't agree with that. The vast majority of the time period, um, there were nothing that appeared to be human-like here. Maybe some human ancestors that were still more like chimpanzees, but it's not until 2 or so million years ago that humans here, first hominids appear, right? Between 2 million, 5.3 million years ago. And modern humans didn't really appear until almost just under 2 million years ago. During what period and epoch did primates? Oh, here we're talking about primates. Okay. When did primates first appear? Right here. So this is the epoch and this is the period. Oligocene and Tertiary. All right, so the point of all this is for you guys to practice being able to decipher a table like this. Okay, so just being able to decode the information on this chart. All right. And then I gave you the answer to the hominids, all right? So you guys can fill that in. The scientific name for humans is Homo sapiens. And note they italicize the name and separate genus and species. That's the convention for writing scientific names. What period and epoch is the age of the Homo sapien? All right, so modern humans, right? The age of the Homo sapien. That's age of the Homo sapien. That's currently now. In fact, they're I'm not so sure how well accepted it is right now, but maybe you've heard of something called the Anthropocene. Anthropocene. Anthro meaning human, the age of humans. And they're thinking of adding it, separating the Holocene into the, pushing the Holocene back and and naming the current time period that we're in the Anthropocene because we've actually affected the geology of the planet so much with habitat destruction, the introduction of plastics, which never degrade. Right, so you'll be if there's a scientist somewhere on Earth a couple of million years from now, they'll be able to see and detect a layer of plastic for this time period throughout the planet. All right, so you guys can complete this. All right, why wouldn't you expect to find human fossils and dinosaur fossils together in rocks dated similarly? They evolved at different times, right? Evolved at different times. And the non-avian dinosaurs, and I say non-avian because birds, the avians, are in fact dinosaurs. The non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. Okay, and they went extinct 65 million years ago. That's the line that's drawn 65 million years ago that the non-avian dinosaurs died out. Okay, in this one, let's see, because the time scale tells when various groups evolved and flourished, it might seem that evolution has been a series of events leading only from the first cell to humans. This, of course, is not the case. For example, prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea never declined and are still the most abundant and successful organisms on Earth. Even today, they constitute 90% of the total weight of organisms. Then, two, the timescale lists mass extinctions, but it doesn't tell when specific groups became extinct. Extinction is the total disappearance of a species. Right? Currently, we're experiencing a mass extinction of our own, created by human beings. And again, habitat loss, climate change, disease. So, mass extinction occurs when a large number of species disappear in a few million years or less. In our case, there's one that's currently happening just a few hundred years. For lack of space, the geological time scale can't depict in detail what happened to the members of every group mentioned. Right? Figure 12.1 does show how mass extinction affected a few groups of animals. Which of the animals shown in this figure suffered the most during the PT extinction? All right, the Permian Triassic. Permian Triassic here. This one. PT. Permian dash Triassic extinction. So you look at these, this is like a bar graph almost. And you look to see, see how wide this structure is. It gets a little bit wider and wider, and then it gets a little bit more narrow, and then it really gets wide afterwards. Okay, so you look and to see, well, at this point, what became narrow? Well, these ammonoids became a little bit narrow, but not so much. But this group seems to have suffered quite a bit. What is that? These are the brachiopods. They still exist today, of course, but that's your answer, brachiopods. For whatever reason, that's the group that suffered the most. Insects, you could argue that they suffered the second most. The ammonoids barely registered a change, although they did become reduced. So you say brachiopods. Which animal shown in Figure 12.1 became extinct during the KT extinction? The KT extinction. KT. K is the German spelling for Cretaceous. Cretaceous, Tertiary. Okay. So that's right here, 65 and a half. Well, the ammonoids died out. The non-avian dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs died out. Okay, so those two groups. So you could say ammonoids and non-avian dinos. All right. The fossil record depends heavily on anatomical data to show the evolutionary changes that have occurred as one group gives rise to another group. Why would that be? This is due to common ancestry, right? Maybe they're looking for a different kind of answer, which is, hey, you can't get DNA from fossils, right? No molecular data. Okay. So that was this page. Don't worry about this page so much. All right, so in the lab we would have had a box full of fossils, and you guys would have been able to look at them and handle them, and describe them a little bit and see what eras and periods they belong to. Okay, so don't worry about this either. The same thing for these types of fossils and plant fossils. Okay. So yeah, it's kind of a shame that we're not able to do this in lab. But that's okay. The idea behind all of this is the most important thing. Okay, in this section, you study the geological timescale and various fossils represented in the record. The geological timescale gives powerful evidence of evolution because fossils are, we call this, evidence of past life. Fossils can be arranged. What are they talking about? Because according to similarities, right? Similarities with extant groups. Extant. Or maybe they're talking about arrangement in terms of age. By age. Maybe that's what they're talking about. You guys pick the answer you feel the most comfortable with. Younger fossils and not older fossils are more like the groups of organisms living today. More like extant organisms. In short, the fossil record shows that organisms are related to each other. I think that's what they want. Organisms are related. I don't get an answer book for this. Organisms are related to one another. All right, there we go. So this is a kind of ambiguous questions, and I gave you the answers that make the most sense to me. All right, I don't get an answer booklet with this stuff. All right. Oh, here's that figure I showed you in the PowerPoint. All right, that's this page. And again, here's the ancestral condition. It has a humerus and race, ulna, carpals, phalanges, the green ones, and these are the metacarpals. These are the metacarpals over here. This one, the green ones, and these are the phalanges. There we go, phalanges, which is the digits. And if you look in lab, we would have had examples of skeletons of all these groups of organs. We would have been able to look at the skeleton arm of humans and some birds, cat, lizard, and we have bat also. We would have been able to see these structures for our own cells and note, yeah, you know what? These structures are very similar to each other. These are homologous structures, right? They're constructed in the same way, even though they may have evolved for different functions, but not too much, right? The function for all of them, of course, is locomotion, except for maybe the human arm, which we use for grabbing things and holding onto them. All right, but you can always argue babies crawl, right? And they use their arms for crawling. Okay, so there is basically, this is variation upon a theme. This is the theme, and variation amongst that particular theme. These arms are not meant to support our weight, but to grab things, hold on to things, and manipulate items. While this arm is for locomotion, as is this. So this arm can maybe even help in jumping and grabbing things also. And this arm is meant for flight, as is this one. All right, so variations upon a theme. And if you studied, if any of you decide to go on with biology and study something like botany or any group, you'll see the same thing. You have a theme, which is a particular design, and then the closely related organisms, that share that design, are just variations of that theme. Right. So that's how we also organize flowering plants. Flowering plants are organized into families, as are all organisms. But flowering plants are cool because the families of flowering plants, um, within those families, the flowers of each species are extremely similar to each other. So much so that a trained botanist can identify the family that a plant belongs to just by looking at the flower. Even if it's a plant he or she has never seen before, you can still identify the family of that flowering plant. So this is variation upon a theme. Okay. All right. So adaptation to a way of life can explain the modifications that have occurred. Relate the change in bone structure to the mode of locomotion into examples. So you can do a bird, right? And reduction of phalanges, of fingers, flight. That's a nice example. And bat is uh, elongation, right? Elongation of yours. Phalanges, we'll call them phalanges. This is a science class. For, again, flight. Okay. Here, comparison of ones that are the common ancestor. Okay, so look at the lizard. The lizard, here it is. The lizard has everything that the common ancestor has. Absolutely everything. So bones that resemble, it has a humerus. You can just write H for humerus. It has an ulna. It has a radius. It has carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. All right, you can just do it this way. All right, bird is different. The phalanges are a little bit different. These are reduced. Okay. The phalanges here are elongated. Okay, so you can fill. So yeah, fill this out on your own. You guys can just write out the words. C for carpal, M P for phalanges. All right, so as you can see, the set and to I don't know what's the word that he used here. Their own way of life, right? I guess it's as simple as that. A way of life. Okay. Comparison of vertebrate embryos. That's the developmental embryo. Sorry, not developmental. Embryological evidence. Embryological. Embryological evidence. Okay. In figure 12.6, the reptile and bird embryo resemble each other more than either resembles a fish. What does that tell you about the evolutionary relationship? Well, a bird and reptile are more closely related. In fact, this is a little bit outdated because, as it happens, birds are considered part of the reptile lineage, right? Because they are dinosaurs. They're called archosaurs. If you include crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds together in one clade, you can call them archosaurs. And that's because birds are, in fact, dinosaurs, the descendants of dinosaurs, still considered dinosaurs. All right, so here's what they're talking about. Here you have a reptile. Okay, here are some characteristics that all chordates, vertebrates, which are chordates, share. You have pharyngeal pouches. You have a dorsal spinal cord. They all have it. Here, here, here. Okay. A post-anal tail. There, there, there. So, okay. So here's the dorsal spinal cord. These are some of the characteristics that all vertebrates have, that all chordates have. All right. And note that the bird and the reptile are a little bit more similar to each other than they are to the fish. Right? They have a larger head. They have this ear. What else? All right, you can even talk about how many chambers the heart has. Obtain prepared slides of the vertebrate embryos and observe each other. List 5 similarities of the embryos. Oh, I listed some here, right? So you guys can use, they all have pharyngeal pouches. They all have a brain. They all have an eye. They all have a heart. Yolk stalk. There's so many of them to talk about. This is not a difference. I mean, this is not a similarity. That's a difference. Vertebrate embryos resemble one another because they share the same answer again. They share a common ancestor. All right, and then we go on to comparison of chimpanzee and human skeletons. Chimpanzees and humans are closely related, as is apparent from an examination of their skeletons. which we wouldn't be able to do in the lab anyway. We'd just be doing it from the book. However, they are adapted to different ways of life. Chimpanzees are adapted to living in trees and are herbivorous. Okay, they eat mainly plants. So yeah, they're carnivores as well. Humans are adapted to walking on the ground and are omnivorous. They eat both plants and meat. Look, chimpanzees eat a lot of meat. Take this with a grain of salt here. All right, so we're going to compare structures between chimpanzees and humans. I already used this here, this page. This is a good exercise for you guys, so you can, compare us to our closest cousins. All right, so the first, head and torso. Where are the head and trunk with relation to the hips and legs? Thrust forward over the hips and legs, or balanced over the hips and legs? All right, so the chimpanzee, the head is thrust forward, while for humans, it's balanced over the hips and legs. Okay, so humans equals balanced, and chimps equals thrust forward. Okay. Which animal has a long and curved lumbar region, and which has a short and stiffer lumbar? How does this contribute to an erect posture in humans? All right, this, as you can see, this is a curve. You see it curves right around there. You have your backbone should be an S. The chimpanzees have a long, stiff one, a short and stiff one. I apologize. Okay, so which animal has a short, stiff? Short plus stiff equals chimps. I'm not going to write it out. You guys write it out. And long and curved equals humans. How does this contribute to an erect posture? This helps with balance. Right? If your back hurts, you're not going to have a good balance. So head and torso. Here we go. Short plus stiff. You just kind of fill it out again, and this is long and curved. Oh, I apologize. That's the wrong one. So this is short and stiff. Short plus stiff. This is long plus curved. Head and torso, thrust forward, right? This one's thrust forward. And this one, for humans, is balanced. The pelvis. Chimpanzees sway when they walk because lifting one leg throws them off balance. Which animal has a narrow and long pelvis? Okay, and which has a broad and short pelvis? Our pelvis is broad and short. This one's broad plus short. And this is long and narrow. And we're evolved for broad and short for holding up our weight, as well as, with the females, the pelvis is broader and shorter than males because they have to give birth to those little babies that have broad shoulders. All right, the femur. Here we go. Femur. In humans, the femur better supports the trunk. In which animal is the femur angled between articulations with the pelvic girdle and the knee? So here's the angle. You see, these are not parallel to each other. These are more or less parallel. So this is angled. and these are straight. Knee joint. So you see that in humans, right at the knee, the femur is at its widest. Here we go. Okay, and um, yeah, and in the chimpanzees, yeah, it's still at its widest, but not as wide as you see in humans. And the tibia is at its widest as well, at the top, right where the knee is. So this would be the patella. This is the tibia. Okay, so it's not so apparent in chimpanzees, and that's because of all the weight we put on our knees. I mean, take a moment to appreciate your knees because they're very important. They take a lot of weight. So knee joint. Um, what kind of answer? The knee joint is modified to support the body's weight. In which animal is the femur larger at the bottom? Okay, so here, tibia plus femur support. I guess you can say support the knee. Okay, and not here. Oh, foot. In humans, the foot is adapted for walking long distances and running with less chance of injury. In which animal is the big toe opposable? That's the chimp. And how does an opposable toe assist chimpanzees? Uh, it's just another hand. Which foot has an arch? Humans. How does an arch assist humans? See, if they're giving you the answer to the next sentence, why do they ask? How does an arch assist humans? It gives you that spring in your step. I'm going to be a little bit funny here. Spring in your step. There you go. I'll accept that as an answer. All right, so foot, opposable toe, chimps. Sorry, that's not the way you should write it. Just have the opposable toe. I apologize. I need water. Opposable toe. What do they want? Okay, chimp. Opposable. Oh, maybe they just want present or absent, right? So this one we could say, let's write that instead. Present and absent. Although I believe there is a group of humans that have a very nearly opposable toe, and I think they're indigenous groups in South America somewhere. And this is absent. In the chimpanzees, don't have an arch in their foot, and this is present. That's the simplest answer I can come up with. All right. So, how does the difference in the position of the foramen magnum? Okay, the foramen magnum is right here, and you can't see it here, but it's back there. It's the exact position at which the spine meets the skull. A large opening in the base of the skull. There he goes. Here they're explaining it for the spinal cord. Correlate with the posture and stance. Right. So in chimps, the foramen magnum is towards the back. In humans, the foramen magnum is directly underneath. All right, and that's because since it's directly underneath, you can balance the head over the rest of the body. And in chimpanzees, since it's towards the back of the skull, it thrusts the skull forward. All right, and then they discuss a few other things here. We're almost done. Supraorbital ridge. That is this. Very prominent in ancestral humans as well. For which skull is the supraorbital ridge thicker? Of course, that would be the chimpanzees. thicker, okay, thinner. Sagittal crest, that is this. All right, and that's just for muscle attachment of the jaw muscles. All right, and that just means that they're going to need some stronger jaw muscles to be able to chew through all that vegetable matter and raw meat. And while humans don't really need that much of muscle power for their jaws, so you never want to be bitten by a chimpanzee. If any of you are ever in a situation where you're that close to a chimpanzee, make sure you don't get bitten by any of them. So this is, I guess you could say, present and absent. You know, if you ever want to look at a picture of a of an ape skull that has a huge sagittal crest, look for a picture of a gorilla, a male gorilla. Slope of frontal bone. Ah, okay. So here's the frontal bone, and look at that slope. Now, the slope here is quite steep, here is shallow. So humans have, this is steep, and I don't know, I guess you could say highly sloped. Has a large slope, numerically speaking, if you were to graph it. Teeth. Oh, what do they want about the teeth? Oh, you should read here, right? Compare the slope of the frontal bones of the chimpanzee. How are they different? Okay. They didn't give us any more information. Teeth. Examine the teeth of the adult chimpanzee and adult humans. Are the incisors two front teeth? Okay. Are the incisors vertical or angled? Ah, so here they are angled, right? It's because the mouth protrudes in front of the face. Are the molars larger or moderate in size? All right, so these molars are actually a little bit bigger than what you find in the humans. Okay, incisors equals protruding, while molars are large. And here the incisors are, what do they call it? Straight down? Is that what they said? Vertical. Vertical? Ooh, I didn't spell vertical correctly. I did. While the molars are small. And the chin. Ah, okay. What is the position of the mouth and the chin in relation to the profile of each skull? All right, the chin is this portion here. For chimpanzees, the chin is I don't know how you say back, while for humans it's protruding. If you don't believe me, go ahead and feel your chin and how it sticks out in front of your teeth. All right. Do your observations show that the skeletal differences between chimpanzees and humans can be related to posture? Oh, yes. Explain your answer. Um, uh, there are, you can say there are changes, there are specific, you can say specific differences relating to balance. Do your observations show that diet can be related to the skull features of humans and chimps? Yes. Right. Chimps have larger teeth. All right, so this part here is interesting, but not necessary. All right, you guys don't have to do these 2 pages. Uh, sorry, You don't have to do this one page, this one, and we don't have to discuss this either, or that, or the top of that. So that takes us to the end of the chapter. What has occurred when a group of bacteria becomes resistant to specific antibiotic? So that's one of the things that's happening today. They've Scientists have figured out that over the last 50 or 60 or 70 years, doctors have been prescribing antibiotics so much. It's even in our soap, our hand soap, and sometimes it's in our hand sanitizers. And they've been prescribing it so much that bacteria have been given a chance to evolve to resist antibiotic uh, chemicals, medications, and the bacteria that are immune to antibiotics are the bacteria that get to reproduce and have offspring, and they pass down that trait, that heritable trait, to the next generation, and so on, until eventually the bacteria that are antibiotic resistant are the most numerous. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Last week I sent out a video discussing how, it was a little video for fun about how bacteria have evolved to digest plastic. Well, with the use of enzymes. Well, isn't that amazing? It only took 50 years for bacteria to evolve a new trait. Well, the same thing for antibiotics. All right, so we call that evolution, right? Evolution has occurred. In addition to comparative anatomy and molecular evidence, what shows that all organisms are related to one another? Fossil evidence. What era of geological time are we in currently? According to this, is the Holocene, right? Well, just leave it at the Holocene. Am I right? I'm pretty sure I'm correct. Holocene. During what period of geological time did the coal-forming forests flourish? Carboniferous. During what era of geological time did the first cells evolve? Let's just call it Precambrian. How many significant mass extinctions have occurred? All right, so we're definitely going to have to go back to that chart and count. I think it's 5 or 6. We'll check our previous answer as well. Uh-oh. There you go. And the first cells arrive. The oldest, I forgot the question now. Okay, oldest eukaryotic cells, fossils, eukaryotic cells, 2 billion years ago, and 3.5 billion for the oldest bacterial cells. And then how many extinctions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we count 5. Okay. Oh, what was the name of that? We're going to call it Precambrian, right? Yeah, Precambrian time for that. I do believe I was correct after all. There we go. Yeah. So this is correct. And this is 5. What do most fossils consist of? Because these parts are not consumed or decomposed over time. Hard body parts. Or just hard parts. For which group of organisms, invertebrates, vertebrates, or plants, is the fossil record not as good as that for the other two? Invertebrates. Those are the soft-bodied animals. Invertebrates, for the most part. There are invertebrates that have shells and they survive. Their bodies survive geological time. What term describes parts of organisms that exhibit similar basic structures and embryonic origins? Homologous. In addition to a post-anal tail and a dorsal nerve cord, what structures are observed in vertebrate embryos? What did we say? The pharyngeal gill slits, right? Or pharyngeal pouches is the term that they use in this book. If it never becomes clear, yeah, it says pouches. Pharyngeal pouches. Do the skulls of chimpanzees or humans have a sagittal crest? Chimps. What hominid genus flourished 2.8 million years ago? I didn't realize how long this chapter was. Hominid, first hominid. Which? Oh, I see. That's why I didn't know the answer because we didn't cover it. 2.8 million years ago, that would be around here. That's Australopithecus africanus. That's an outdated genus. Okay. Let's write it down. Australopithecus. That means southern ape. Austro-southern Pithecus ape. Australopithecus africanus. The amino acid sequence of what electron carrier protein has been determined for a variety of organisms. Okay, we didn't cover that, but that's for the Krebs cycle. If you don't know what that means, I wouldn't worry about it unless it's covered in lecture. Are two species closely or distantly related if the antibodies to the antigens of... We didn't cover that either. Okay, so that takes us to the end. That's the end of that. All right, we didn't cover that specific topic, so I won't hold you to those types of questions. All right, guys. Thank you for holding on, and thanks for whoever pointed out I forgot to press the record button. I had to start over. All right. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. And tomorrow we'll be going on to the next chapter, which is animal diversity, and then there'll be the weekend. All right, guys. And if you haven't taken your exam yet, you have until 7. Okay, and most of you have, but just make sure that you complete that today. All right. Thank you. Bye. You're welcome.